for it. I shall detail my life, my work. I shall reveal myself as the man responsible for the 3 years' duration of the Pacific War of 2004. You? None other. Had I not been a loyal Netherlands subject at that time, and therefore neutral, the forces of Asia would have been crushed in 3 months instead of 3 years. The subjunctivisor tells me so. I would have invented a calculator to forecast the changes of every engagement. Van Manderpootz would have removed the hit or miss element in the conduct of war. He frowned solemnly. There is my idea. The autobiography of Van Manderpootz. What do you think of it? I recovered my thoughts. It's colossal, I said vehemently. I'll buy a copy myself, several copies. I'll send them to friends. I, said Van Manderpootz expansively, shall autograph your copy for you. It will be priceless. I shall write in some fitting phrase, perhaps something like Magnificus sed non superbus, great but not proud. That well describes Van Manderpootz, who despite his greatness is simple, modest, and unassuming. Don't you agree? Perfectly. A very apt description of you, but couldn't I see your subjunctivisor before it's dismantled to make way for the greater work? Ah, you wish to find out something. Yes, Professor, do you remember the Baikal disaster of a week or two ago? I was to have taken that liner to Moscow. I just missed it. I related the circumstances. Humph, he grunted. You wish to discover what would have happened had you caught it, eh? Well, I see several possibilities. Among the world of if is the one that would have been real if you had been on time, the one that depended on the vessel waiting for your actual arrival, and the one that hung on your arriving within the 5 minutes they actually waited. In which are you interested? Oh, the last one. That seemed the likeliest. After all, it was too much to expect that Dixon Wells could ever be on time. And as to the second possibility, well, they hadn't waited for me, and that in a way removed the weight of responsibility. Come on, rumbled Van Manderpootz. I followed him across to the physics building and into his littered laboratory. The device still stood on the table, and I took my place before it, staring at the screen of the Horston psychomat. The clouds wavered and shifted as I sought to impress my memories on their suggestive shapes, to read into them some picture of that vanishing morning. Then I had it. I made out the vista from the Staten Bridge, and was speeding across the giant span toward the airport. I waved a signal to Van Manderpootz. The thing clicked, and the subjunctivisor was on. The grassless clay of the field appeared. It is a curious thing about the psychomat that you see only through the eyes of your image on the screen. It lends a strange reality to the working of the toy. I suppose a sort of self-hypnosis is partly responsible. I was rushing over the ground toward the glittering silver-winged projectile that was the Baikal. A glowering officer waved me on, and I dashed up the slant of the gangplank and into the ship. The port dropped, and I heard a long whew of relief. "Sit down," barked the officer, gesturing toward an unoccupied seat. I fell into it. The ship quivered under the thrust of the catapult, grated harshly into motion, and then was flung bodily into the air. The blasts roared instantly, then settled to a more muffled throbbing, and I watched Staten Island drop down and slide back beneath me. The giant rocket was under way. Whew, I breathed again. Made it. I caught an amused glance from my right. I was in an aisle seat. There was no one to my left, so I turned to the eyes that had flashed, glanced, and froze, staring. It was a girl. Perhaps she wasn't actually as lovely as she looked to me. After all, I was seeing her through the half-visionary screen of the psychomat. I've told myself since that she couldn't have been as pretty as she seemed, that it was due to my own imagination filling in the details. I don't know. I remember only that I stared at curiously lovely silver-blue eyes and velvety brown hair and a small amused mouth and an impudent nose. I kept staring until she flushed. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I was startled." There's a friendly atmosphere aboard a transoceanic rocket. The passengers are forced into a crowded intimacy for anywhere from 7 to 12 hours, and there isn't much room for moving about. Generally, one strikes up an acquaintance with his neighbors. Introductions aren't at all necessary, and the custom is simply to speak to anybody you choose. Something like an all-day trip on the railroad trains of the last century, I suppose. You make friends for the duration of the journey, and then, 9 times out of 10, you never hear of your traveling companions again. The girl smiled. "Are you the individual responsible for the delay in starting?" I admitted it. "I seem to be chronically late. Even watches lose time as soon as I wear them." She laughed. "Your responsibilities can't be very heavy." "Well, they weren't, of course, though it's surprising how many clubs, caddies, and chorus girls have depended on me at various times for appreciable portions of their incomes. But somehow I didn't feel like mentioning those things to the silvery-eyed girl. We talked. Her name, it developed, was Joanna Caldwell, and she was going as far as Paris. She was an artist, or hoped to be one day, and of course there is no place in the world that can supply both training and inspiration like Paris. So it was there she was bound for a year of study, and despite her demurely humorous lips and laughing eyes, I could see that the business was of vast importance to her. I gathered that she had worked hard for the year in Paris, had scraped and saved for 3 years as fashion illustrator for some women's magazine, though she couldn't have been many months over 21. Her painting meant a great deal to her, and I could understand that. I'd felt that way about polo once. So you see, we were sympathetic spirits from the beginning. I knew that she liked me, and it was obvious that she didn't connect Dixon Wells with the N.J. Wells Corporation. And as for me, well, after that first glance into her cool silver eyes, I simply didn't care to look anywhere else. The hours seemed to drip away like minutes while I watched her. You know how those things go. Suddenly I was calling her Joanna, and she was calling me Dick, and it seemed as if we'd been doing just that all our lives. I'd decided to stop over in Paris on my way back from Moscow, and I'd secured her promise to let me see her. She was different, I tell you. She was nothing like the calculating Whimsy White, and still less like the dancing, simpering, giddy youngsters one meets around at social affairs. She was just Joanna, cool and humorous, yet sympathetic and serious, and as pretty as a Majolica figurine. We could scarcely realize it when the steward passed along to take orders for luncheon. 4 hours out? It seemed like 40 minutes. And we had a pleasant feeling of intimacy in the discovery that both of us liked lobster salad and detested oysters. It was another bond. I told her whimsically that it was an omen, nor did she object to considering it so. Afterwards we walked along the narrow aisle to the glassed-in observation room up forward. It was almost too crowded for entry, but we didn't mind that at all, as it forced us to sit very close together. We stayed long after both of us had begun to notice the stuffiness of the air. It was just after we had returned to our seats that the catastrophe occurred. There was no warning save a sudden lurch, the result, I suppose, of the pilot's futile last-minute attempt to swerve. Just that, and then a grinding crash and a terrible sensation of spinning, and after that a chorus of shrieks that were like the sounds of battle. It was battle. 500 people were picking themselves up from the floor, were trampling each other, milling around, being cast helplessly down as the great rocket plane, its left wing but a broken stub, circled downward toward the Atlantic. The shouts of officers sounded, and a loudspeaker blared. "Be calm," it kept repeating. And then, "There has been a collision. We have contacted a surface ship. There is no danger. There is no danger." I struggled up from the debris of shattered seats. Joanna was gone. Just as I found her crumpled between the rows, the ship struck the water with a jar that set everything crashing again. The speaker blared, "Put on the cork belts under the seats. The life belts are under the seats." I dragged a belt loose and snapped it around Joanna, then donned one myself. The crowd was surging forward now, and the tail end of the ship began to drop. There was water behind us, sloshing in the darkness as the lights went out. An officer came sliding by, stooped, and fastened a belt about an unconscious woman ahead of us. "You all right?" he yelled, and passed on without waiting for an answer. The speaker must have been cut onto a battery circuit. "And get as far away as possible," it ordered suddenly. "Jump from the forward port, and get as far away as possible. A ship is standing by. You will be picked up. Jump from the—" It went dead again. I got Joanna untangled from the wreckage. She was pale. Her silvery eyes were closed. I started dragging her slowly and painfully toward the forward port, and the slant of the floor increased until it was like the slide of a ski jump. The officer passed again. "Can you handle her?" he asked, and again dashed away. I was getting there. The crowd around the port looked smaller, or was it simply huddling closer? Then suddenly a wail of fear and despair went up, and there was a roar of water. The observation room walls had given. I saw the green surge of waves, and a billowing deluge rushed down upon us. I had been late again. That was all. I raised shocked and frightened eyes from the subjunctivisor to face Van Manderpootz, who was scribbling on the edge of the table. "Well?" he asked. I shuddered. "Horrible," I murmured. I guess we wouldn't have been among the survivors." "We, eh? We?" His eyes twinkled. I did not enlighten him.